The deep woods hold secrets older than time itself. Shadows move when no one is there, whispers ride the wind, and those who stray too far from the path may never return. Tonight, we bring you 4 terrifying stories of encounters deep within the forest. And in each of them, a presence lurks, one that has haunted these lands for centuries. Watch closely and listen carefully, because the deeper you go, the harder it is to escape. This is Deep Wood Horror Stories, and something is watching you. Story 1, The Pale One in the Pines. There are places in this world where the trees stand like silent watchers, where the wind carries whispers, and where something ancient lingers just beyond the edge of perception. Tonight, we step into such a place, a story of those who ventured too far and glimpsed something they were never meant to see. Daniel had always loved the wilderness. He grew up with stories of the deep woods told by his grandfather. Tales of strange figures seen among the trees, of whispers in the wind that never quite sounded human. But Daniel never truly believed them. They were just stories after all. One autumn weekend, he and his 2 closest friends, Eric and Melissa, decided to camp deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The plan was simple: set up camp near an old hunting trail, enjoy a night under the stars, and hike back at sunrise. It was a crisp evening, the sky a tapestry of stars above the towering pines. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. But as the night settled in, something felt off. It started with the stillness. The sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures had gone completely silent. Eric was the first to notice. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Melissa frowned. "I don't hear anything." Exactly. A cold wind rushed through the trees, carrying the faintest hint of something rotten. It was subtle, but it made Daniel's stomach turn. They laughed it off, convincing themselves it was just the eerie quiet of an unfamiliar place. But then came the footsteps. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible, just beyond the tree line. Slow, measured, circling. "Probably just a deer," Daniel muttered, shining his flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the dark, revealing only gnarled branches and shifting shadows. But then something changed. The footsteps stopped, and something breathed. Not an animal, not human. Something low, rattling, just behind them. Melissa gasped, spinning toward the sound. But there was nothing. The fire flickered violently, as if something unseen had passed between them. Eric grabbed his knife. "We should leave. Now." Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. The 3 of them packed their gear in a frenzy, adrenaline surging. But as they turned to leave, Melissa let out a strangled gasp. Standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim firelight, was a figure, tall, gaunt. Its skin was a sickly pale, stretched tightly over elongated limbs. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the shadows, but Daniel could feel its gaze, cold, empty, watching, and then it moved, not like a person, not like an animal. Its movements were disjointed, jerky, like something that had forgotten how to mimic life. It took a step forward, then another, its limbs bending in ways that defied reason. Melissa screamed. Eric dropped the lantern, and then the thing spoke, a voice that wasn't a voice, a perfect mimicry of Melissa's own panicked cry. "Run!" The 3 of them sprinted. Branches whipped against their faces as they tore through the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly. But the thing was behind them, fast, unrelenting. They could hear it crashing through the underbrush, always just a breath away. Daniel saw the old hunting trail ahead. If they could just make it back to the car. Melissa tripped. Eric and Daniel skidded to a stop as she hit the ground hard, her flashlight rolling away into the darkness, and that's when Daniel saw it up close. The pale one. It loomed over Melissa, its elongated fingers twitching, reaching. Its mouth, or what should have been a mouth, stretched open in an unnatural grin. But the worst part? It wore her face. Not perfectly. Like a mask, a warped, grotesque imitation of Melissa's own terrified expression. And then, in Daniel's voice, it whispered, "Help me." Daniel didn't think. He grabbed Melissa's arm and yanked her to her feet. The three of them bolted, not daring to look back. The car was in sight. They stumbled in, slammed the doors, and Daniel turned the key with shaking hands. The engine roared to life. Headlights cut through the darkness, and for a fleeting second they saw it, standing just beyond the reach of the light, watching, unmoving, waiting. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. They never spoke of that night again, but sometimes when Daniel is alone, he hears it, his own voice, whispering his name, calling him back to the woods. Some say the deep woods hold secrets older than time itself, and sometimes those secrets stare back. If you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, and the trees go silent, and the air turns cold, listen carefully. You might not be alone. Before we continue, a warning. The stories you are about to hear are not for the faint of heart. They are whispers from the darkness, echoes of things best left forgotten. But if you crave the unknown, if you seek the truth hidden in the shadows, then join us. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like a simple action, but in the realm of the unknown, every choice matters. And tonight, you might just wish you had stayed in the light. Story 2, The Shadow That Walks. The deep woods have always been a place of mystery. Shadows stretch longer than they should. Whispers carry on the wind, calling names that were never spoken aloud. But sometimes, something in the dark listens back. And when it follows you home, there is no escape. Darren never should have taken that shortcut through the woods. It was a mistake. He knew that now. He had driven down that old dirt road countless times before. An empty stretch of forgotten land winding through the thick forest. It wasn't on any official maps, but the locals called it Dead Man's Hollow. No one really knew why. Some said it was an old hunting ground. Others whispered about disappearances. But Darren never paid much attention to stories like that. Not until that night. He had left work late, the sky already dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. His usual route home was blocked due to an accident, so he took the back road. The trees loomed tall on either side of the narrow path, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for his truck. Halfway through, he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Darren slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering. His headlights illuminated a tall, emaciated shape, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a tangled mess of dark, matted hair. It was barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, and it didn't move, just stood there, watching. Darren swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. A lost hiker, a drunk. He rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. The figure tilted its head, not like a person, like an animal sizing up prey. A deep, twisting dread coiled in Darren's gut. He didn't wait. He threw the truck into reverse, ready to turn around, but as his taillights cut through the trees, the figure was suddenly behind him. It hadn't moved. It had just appeared. Darren's breath caught in his throat. That was impossible. No one could move that fast. His hand shot to the gear shift, jamming it into drive, but before he could accelerate, thump! A heavy hand slapped against his window. Darren whipped his head around. The figure was pressed against the glass, its fingers too long, its skin stretched too tight, its lips pulled back in a grotesque grin, and then in his own voice it whispered, "Let me in." Darren screamed. He floored the gas pedal. The truck roared forward, tires spitting dirt and gravel. He didn't look back. Didn't dare. The road stretched endlessly before him, the dark trees blurring together. His knuckles were white against the wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. But then the whisper came again. "Let me in." From the back seat, Darren's world tilted. He couldn't breathe. His own voice, distorted, wrong, was inside the truck. He wasn't alone. Summoning every ounce of willpower, he forced himself to look in this rearview mirror, and there it was, crammed into the tiny space between the seats, its head tilted at an impossible angle, grinning with teeth that weren't human. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, its black eyes sunken deep into its face. And then it began to change. Its limbs contorted, its skin shifted, mimicking him. Within seconds, it had taken his form, a perfect copy only. Its grin was too wide, its eyes too empty. Darren's mind fractured. He wrenched the wheel to the side, sending the truck skidding off the road, crashing through the underbrush before slamming to a stop against a tree. Silence. Pain lanced through his ribs, his vision swimming. But when he turned, the thing was gone. His own reflection in the mirror stared back at him. Shaking, Darren fumbled for his door handle, stumbling out into the night. The forest loomed around him, suffocatingly quiet. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He had to get home. Ignoring the pain, he started walking. The road wasn't far. If he could just... A voice. His voice. "Where are you going?" Darren froze. The sound came from ahead, from the trees. He turned slowly and saw himself standing in the shadows. The thing had his face now, his voice, his clothes. It smiled, stepping closer, its joints cracking as it moved. "You should have let me in." Darren ran. Branches whipped against his face as he tore through. The forest, lungs burning, legs screaming for relief. The road had to be close, had to be. His house. He was home. Darren nearly collapsed as he stumbled onto his porch, his fingers shaking as he jammed his key into the lock. He shoved the door open, slamming it shut behind him, locking it. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to breathe. Safe. He was safe. Or so he thought. Because then, from the other side of the door, came the sound of a key turning in the lock. Darren's blood ran cold. He stepped back as the knob twisted. The door creaked open, and there, standing in his doorway, was himself, smiling. Some things don't just watch from the woods. Some things follow you home. And when they do, they won't stop until they've taken everything you are. Story 3. The Echo in the Trees. The deep woods hold more than just trees and wildlife. There are things that whisper your name in the dark, things that wear your face, things that know you better than you know yourself. But if you hear an echo in the trees, be careful, because sometimes it's not your own voice calling back. Jason had never been afraid of the forest. Growing up in Montana, the deep woods were like a second home to him. He had spent countless weekends camping, hunting, and hiking through the rugged terrain. He knew the sounds of the wilderness, the rustling leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, the chirping of crickets in the night. But that night, something was wrong. He and his younger brother Sam had set up camp in a remote part of the forest, miles from the nearest town, the kind of place where the stars burned bright in the sky, untouched by city lights. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding, just the two of them, a tent and the wild. But then, the whispering started. Jason was tending to the fire when he heard it, a soft, distant voice, too faint to make out the words. At first, he thought it was the wind, but when he looked up, Sam was already staring into the darkness, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered. Jason nodded. He didn't want to admit how much it unsettled him. "It's probably just the wind," he lied. But the whisper came. Again. Closer. "Jason." His stomach clenched. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the trees. "Who the hell is out there?" Jason called. Silence. The air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, "Jason, come look." It was his own voice. Sam grabbed his arm. "That wasn't you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason's. Blood ran cold. He grabbed the rifle from beside the tent, aiming toward the trees. Nothing but darkness. The fire's glow barely reached the nearest trunks. Beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. Then the whisper came again, from the opposite direction. "Jason, help me!" The voice was identical to his own. His pulse pounded. His grip on the rifle tightened. "We need to go," Sam said, his voice urgent. Jason hesitated. Leaving meant walking into the dark, but staying meant waiting for whatever was out there to come closer. The decision was made for them. A shadow moved between the trees. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were wrong, elongated, twisting unnaturally as it stepped forward. The firelight barely touched its face, but Jason saw just enough. Its eyes, hollow, black, but its mouth was his. "Jason, help me." It grinned, lips stretching too wide, revealing teeth that weren't human. Jason shoved Sam toward the truck. "Run!" They bolted. Branches whipped against their faces as they sprinted through the trees, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The truck was less than a mile away, if they could just make it. Then Sam screamed. Jason spun around. Sam was on the ground, his ankle caught in a twisted root. He struggled, eyes wide with panic, and behind him, it was coming. It moved wrong, like a puppet with broken strings, its limbs snapping unnaturally as it crawled forward. Jason raised the rifle and fired. The gunshot echoed through the trees. The thing didn't flinch, it just smiled wider. Jason yanked Sam to his feet, practically dragging him forward. The truck's headlights were just ahead, salvation within reach. But then, wait! Jason stopped dead, because the voice, his voice, came from behind them. He turned and saw himself standing in the trees. Not the thing. Him. Same face. Same clothes. Same terrified expression. "Don't go with him," the other Jason said, his voice desperate. "That's not Sam." The real Sam gripped Jason's arm. "Don't listen to it," he gasped. "We have to go." Jason's mind fractured. His brother was beside him. He could feel Sam's grip. But the other Jason looked real too. "Jason, please," the voice begged. Panic surged through him. If he chose wrong, then from behind, "Jason, run." That voice, that was Sam's voice. Jason's heart nearly stopped, the grip on his arm. Too strong now, too cold. He didn't think. He moved. With all his strength, he shoved the thing off him, grabbing the other Jason's hand instead. They ran. The truck, the door, the keys, the engine roaring to life. As the headlights washed over the trees, Jason finally saw it. The thing wearing Sam's face stood there, its expression blank now, devoid of life. And then, slowly, it smiled and whispered, "See you soon." Jason floored the gas pedal. They didn't stop until they reached town. The deep woods are full of echoes, but be careful which ones you answer, because sometimes they're not just your own voice calling back. Story 4, What Lurks Beneath the Pines. The deep woods are ancient. They remember things, they watch, they listen, and sometimes they mimic. If you ever hear your own voice calling you from the trees, run. Because something has already seen you, and it wants to be you. Caleb and Emily had always loved the wilderness. Their grandfather had raised them on stories of the deep woods, tales of spirits, shadowed creatures, and warnings about the places humans were never meant to tread. "The forest is alive," he would say, "and it does not forget those who enter." But it was just folklore, stories meant to scare children. That's what Caleb had always believed, until that night. The descent into darkness. The plan had been simple. A weekend hike deep into the Arizona wilderness. Just the two of them, far from the noise of civilization. But something had gone wrong. The map didn't match the land anymore. The trails didn't lead where they should. And then the silence fell. It started subtly. The usual hum of insects vanished. The rustling of small animals disappeared. Even the wind died between the pines. Caleb adjusted his backpack, frowning. "Do you hear that?" Emily stopped walking, listening. She didn't say anything, but he could see it. The tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched near the hunting knife on her belt. She felt it too. Something was wrong. "Let's keep moving," she muttered. They picked up the pace, but the silence followed them, and then came the smell. Rotting meat, thick, cloying, rancid. Emily gagged, covering her nose. "God, what is that?" Caleb scanned the trees, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Then a sound, a whisper. His name, Caleb. It wasn't Emily. He turned so fast his vision blurred. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Too fast, too fluid. Emily grabbed his wrist, her fingers ice cold. "You heard that, right?" she whispered. Caleb nodded, throat dry. "We need to go. Now!" They started moving fast, but the deeper they went, the more the woods twisted around them. The trail that should have led back to camp was gone. The trees looked wrong. Bark split open like something had clawed its way out from the inside. And then the voices started. "Caleb? Emily, where are you?" It was their grandfather's voice, but their grandfather had been dead for years. Emily froze. "No! No, 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 that's not possible." The voice came again, closer now. "Kids, it's not safe out here. Come to me." Emily let out a choked sob. Caleb pulled her forward, whispering, "Don't listen." The voice changed. It became his own voice. "Emily, hurry up. We're leaving." Emily's nails dug into his arm. "That's you," she whispered. Caleb turned, the flashlight toward the trees, and saw himself standing there. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. Him, same clothes, same face, but the eyes were empty. Then it grinned. A wide, grotesque smile, stretching too far across its face. "Come on, Em," it said, perfectly mimicking his voice. Emily screamed. Caleb ran, dragging her with him, sprinting through the trees. Behind them, something ran too, but it wasn't human. The sound was all wrong. Too fast, too many limbs, too much weight hitting the ground. And then Emily tripped. Caleb barely managed to catch her before she hit the ground. But in that split second, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, her flashlight swinging wildly through the darkness. For a moment, just a brief, terrifying moment, Caleb saw it. The thing holding her, too long, too thin, skin stretched too tight over an emaciated frame. It wasn't human, but its face was his, just wrong, a mockery, a twisted imitation of his features, grinning too wide, its head tilting at an impossible angle. Caleb lunged forward, slamming his boot down on its arm. The bones cracked, but it didn't scream. It just laughed. Caleb yanked Emily up and they ran. The cliff's edge. The trees broke, suddenly revealing a sheer drop. A cliff. They skidded to a halt just inches from the edge. Far below, the valley stretched into endless darkness. No way down, no way forward. Caleb turned, heart hammering, and the thing stepped into the moonlight. It wasn't alone. 5 of them, each one a perfect twisted copy of Caleb and Emily, standing side by side watching them. Then, in perfect unison, they grinned and spoke all at once. "Come on, Em, we're leaving." Caleb's blood ran cold. The things turned facing the cliff, and one by one, they stepped off the edge, vanishing into the darkness. Gone. The silence returned. No wind, no insects. And then, a soft, echoing laughter from below. Caleb and Emily didn't wait to see what happened next. They ran. There are things in the deep woods that do not hunt. They imitate, they study, they wait. And when the moment is right, they replace. So tell me, are you sure you're still you? The deeper you go into the woods, the harder it is to return. These forests hold secrets, things that do not wish to be found, but sometimes they find you first. If you made it through these terrifying tales, leave a like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. What is the scariest thing you've ever encountered in the woods? Until next time, stay in the light and don't answer the whispers from the trees.